Lord and Master of all who acknowledge your sovereign rule, teach us to know the true meaning of discipleship. In our enthusiasm for the good news that your kingship is near, let us not forget the cost that must be paid, the loss of self-centeredness, the curbing of uncontrolled ambition, the curtailment of material possessions. As our knowledge of you increases, may it be made complete in our behavior. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
I sound terribly loud to myself. How am I to the rest? Okay. All right. We're looking at number 13, which I've entitled here, Begging and Borrowing. Matthew records, to anyone who asks of you, give. And anyone who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. When we take a look at the identical verse, or almost identical verse in Luke, it reads to anyone, to everyone who asks and you give. And from anyone who takes your goods, do not demand back what is yours. So that clearly these two are from a similar source, but Luke being typically Luke, enhances it with a bit more elegant grammar. If we look at Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, he words it differently, but it's along the same line. If you have money, and in early Christian groups, this wasn't always a certainty, do not lend it at interest, rather give it to one from whom you will not get it back. Then if we could go back to Luke at verse 34, maybe I should draw to your attention that you notice that the numbers I give for Luke, this comes from chapter 6, which is within the body of the Sermon on the Plain. So this is a collection of ethical demands from committed Christians. But what we're reading here are verses 30 and 34, the second half of 35 on into 36. What Luke has done at this point is to create a literary work, a kind of a trilogy. And he starts back in verse 21, which we saw last week, talking about love, loving your enemies, do good to those who persecute you. So the doing good was the second part of his trilogy. And now he comes to a third one, to lend, and he dovetails these. And that's why we have had to jump around from verse 30 to 34. 34 goes with 30, but in the literary construction that Luke has produced, he's dovetailed it with these two other elements, which in Jesus' lifetime would have been presented on different occasions. But it's Matthew and Luke putting these things together to create these sermons, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. But in verse 34, we read in Luke, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Now, we've seen that phrase before, remember, last week. This is the way Luke likes to word what Matthew words differently. And we accepted, or at least these Q scholars accepted Luke's wording, where Matthew had in the next line tax collectors and prostitutes. Luke has sinners, which I personally prefer having sort of completed the study of all of Jesus' sayings, Jesus did not hold any negative attitudes toward tax collectors and prostitutes, whereas a good law-abiding Jewish person, he would recognize that sinning was wrong. It's just that he had a different attitude towards sinners than he did than other people in the religious group had. He was more open and more ready to announce forgiveness. Let's keep that in mind, that Jesus announced forgiveness. Jesus did not actually forgive. He knew that God automatically gave forgiveness to anyone who wished it. So the second half of 34, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, take a look at 35b, lend expecting nothing in return. And this is corroborated by what we read in Thomas, where Thomas said, if you do have any money and you're going to lend it out, and you should, as we saw as far back as Matthew, if anyone is in need and you've got it, give it to them and do not expect anything in return. That's what ordinary people expect. Whether you use the term tax collectors or prostitutes or sinners, that's not really what we mean here. What we mean is, in ordinary society, when you loan money, you expect some kind of return, but that's not the way it works in a Christian group. In a Christian group, you give to those who need, and because they need it, you don't expect it back. That's the standard by which Jesus was holding his followers, and that is precisely what Matthew and Luke are offering in the sermon. The higher ethical standards of Jesus' teachings are brought together in this collection of material. In Matthew's case, for 3 chapters, in Luke's case, only for 30 verses, but it is a standard which most of us find difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. Verse 36 in Luke, be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. We saw last week in saying number 11 that Matthew uses a similar expression, except he says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. What was the origin of these? You can see at the heading here of number 13 that we're saying the source is Q. The verse does not occur in Mark, but it occurs with such similar wording in Matthew and Luke that we're concluding that it comes from Q. But what stood in Q? To be compassionate or to be perfect? Well, when we take a look at other chapters in Matthew, that the term perfect is typical Matthean vocabulary. However, compassionate is not one that is used in connection with fellow Christians that much by Luke. When we take a look at the Old Testament itself, in the book of Leviticus, we have a whole section, about 10 chapters, in what we call the Holiness Code. It's in this section, by the way, which are the legislation about homosexuality, which is in fact badly misunderstood by modern readers, but at least that's where the section is. And the idea is that if you're going to be holy, and what is meant by being holy is if you wish to be in the physical presence of the invisible but physical deity, that is to say, to go inside the sanctuary of the temple, into the Holy of Holies, you yourself have got to be holy. So we're talking here about laws of cleanliness. We're not talking about ordinary behavior. We're talking about ritual cleanliness. So throughout this holiness code, we have a refrain in which the editor of this material says, be holy as God is holy, as Yahweh is holy. It appears that presumably Q has placed this at this point in his collection. Be holy as God is holy, or as in the Christian groups, your Father in heaven is holy. But because Matthew likes the idea of striving for perfection, he uses the word perfect, where Luke, and although we said there isn't really strong evidence that Luke was a physician, one still can't help but feel that, yeah, you can see the physician here in Luke. He uses the word compassionate. Now, when I say he used the word compassion, that's actually my translation. I think the NRSV says mercy, be merciful, but I don't like the word merciful in this sense. What I think is being expressed at this point is a feeling of identifying with someone else's need to the point that you're going to assist, not merciful in the sense of, well, I guess I've got a quarter. That's not what we've got here. And it's why I chose the word compassion. This is not our ordinary word for compassionate. There is another word, a feminine word, by the way. Compassion is something that only a woman can understand. Men can strive towards it, but the basic meaning in Hebrew, the basic meaning of the word compassionate comes from the root word for womb. It's a maternal instinct. It's a maternal feeling. So when I like this idea, when God, our Heavenly Father, is being compassionate, he is being a mother. So let's take a look then at the bottom to what do we feel Jesus said. Well, scholars are more or less universally agreed that we give the highest possible degree of authenticity to the expression, to anyone who asks of you, give. The Christians were known throughout the Roman Empire as people who would give literally the shirt off their back. The second line, you'll notice, drops a bit in degree of authenticity. If you have money, give it to one from whom you will not get it back. And it's not the sentimentality itself, it's the wording. In my mind, this is certainly not the way Jesus said it. But how does one know how Jesus actually said it? What's striking home to me as I go through these is Jesus seemed to have this same kind of gift as we see from the writers of the Proverbs in the book of the Old Testament. He could put things together with just a few words. He put them together more positively than negatively. He put them often ambiguously. He loved parables, for instance, and one of the features of a parable is its ambiguity. You can take the parable, you understand the story, and you walk away thinking, what a great story. But what did he mean? Jesus had a way of saying things that forced you to think. And I think the reason he wanted you to think is because what he was really trying to tell you was contrary to accepted ethical practice. Jesus expected a standard in the kingdom, remember? In the kingdom, there would be a standard of behavior quite above what is in our present real world. That is to say, the world of Jesus. And I'm not so sure that ours is any different. And similarly, with the third line, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, why should you be rewarded? Although I've included this, I'm not as comfortable as I was months ago when I first wrote this down, that is what Jesus would say. I'm increasingly coming to think that Jesus never suggested we should do anything for a reward. Whenever we see in the Gospels the word reward, where we can judge it to go back to Jesus himself, it has more to do with the kingdom. It's not that if this is what you do, you'll be rewarded. No, you don't do it for that reason. Your reward is the entry into the kingdom. If this is the way you behave while you're here, you are assured a place in the kingdom. If you don't behave this way now while you're here, you won't want in the kingdom, because that's what the kingdom is like. So it's not a reward. That's how we're going to do it in the kingdom. And this is I make it sound like it is a reward, but this is your entry ticket. You are learning how to behave in the kingdom. Any questions on 13? Yeah.
You mentioned the word compassionate.
Yes.
And how that's a feminine word.
Yes. Well.
And the root, and it comes from
Yes. In this context, however, this is not so. I have translated this word, which I think the NRSV translates merciful. This is not the ordinary word for compassionate. This is a decision that I made as an interpreter. It's not just as a translator, but as an interpreter. I wanted to get across to you that what I think Jesus is saying in this context is not to show mercy, but to show what we won't normally understand by compassion. That is the kind of feeling a mother has for a child. What will a mother do for a child? Anything and everything. What will a father do? Whatever he can. But there's a limit. There's a difference between what a mother will do and what an employer or a boss or a brother or a sister or even a father will do. Generally speaking, obviously there are exceptions. And I thought, in spite of the Greek word that's here, and see, don't forget, I don't put a whole lot of stock on the Greek word, because I want to go behind the Greek word. Jesus didn't speak Greek. Jesus didn't say the word that we have down here in the Greek text. What did Jesus say behind that? He may very well have said what Leviticus said, that is, be holy like your Father is holy. Now that may very well be what we have in Q, but Q doesn't exist for us. Q we have reconstructed based on what is in Matthew and what is in Luke. But here's a case where Matthew uses one word, and we know darn well it's one of Matthew's favorite words. So we're pretty sure that was not in Q. And here comes Luke with a different word. Could it be what was in Q? Well, I don't think so, because if it had been, it might have been satisfactory to Matthew. So I've gone behind all of this. I've tried to go behind Q. I've gone back to Leviticus and jumped into the 21st century. And I've given you the word compassionate, warning you that it is a feminine emotion.
Well, it's not surprising that you use a feminine word. I mean, in the beginning, God created.
Absolutely.
In his image.
In Genesis 1, we have a very complex creation story in which you'll see that, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And then later dovetailed, you'll see, and God made this, and God did that. The writer, can you believe this? The writer of Genesis chapter 1 was a late 20th century feminist. He has both male and female activity in creation. Women can create out of nothing. I know you have to start with this little tiny seed, but think of it from the ancient world's point of view. Women could produce life out of nothing. And that's what we have God doing in Genesis chapter 1. What do men do? Well, they got to go get some material. And they work away on this material. And when they're finished, there's not anything there that isn't in the material that they were started with. And by the way, nothing men make breeds. And that's what we have in Genesis 1. I made a list once of all of the characteristics of God in the Hebrew Bible and put on one column those that were clearly male and those that were unquestionably female, such as compassion, and everything in the middle that could go either way. Now, you have to be aware of the ancient world. For instance, you would think that a warrior god would be masculine. Not in the ancient world. In the Semitic world, the warrior gods were females. Actually, they were often the same goddess of love was the goddess of war. Hate and love apparently are just the flip side of the same coin. So by the time I had done this, I had on my male column 2. And I had on my clearly must be feminine 2. Everything else was in the middle. So you tell me, even by Old Testament standards, is God male or is God female? The theologians were very careful. They did not go on one side or the other. This is an all-inclusive God. We're ready to move to 14. Let's take a look at Thomas first. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And incidentally, where I've written up in the introduction about Thomas, the complete Gospel of Thomas is almost complete, 99% complete. We're going to see one case where there is a lacuna, a blotch in the fragment. Otherwise, it's complete in Coptic. Coptic is not a language that I read, but a half century earlier, there had been some fragments of a papyri found in Egypt, which turn out to be pieces of the Gospel of Thomas, and that is in Greek. And so when we see the Greek, I can handle it a little bit. So here in chapter 62, or there's really saying 62, there are 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. It's not broken up into chapters, but it's broken up into sayings. But some of the sayings are long enough that scholars have broken up the individual sayings by the number of clauses or sentences. So for instance, here we've got two sentences, and we're not interested in this saying, in what the first half of this saying is about. It clearly is not related to anything we find in the synoptics. But the second one is identical to what we find in the Gospels. Do not let your, and the your is singular, left hand know what your right hand is doing. It's a generalization, but as a generalization, whenever we have the Greek text here, because we can make the same distinction in Hebrew and Aramaic as in Greek, that is a difference between the singular and the plural. We can't do it in English. If we say your, you don't know whether I'm talking to your one or to your everybody or a group. But we can do that in many other languages. In fact, English is one of the few that is that way. So when we've got a singular, it often works out that on other grounds, we judge this saying to be more likely an authentic saying of Jesus. When he talks to a group of people, he's talking to each and every one of us. And that got carried over from the Aramaic into the Greek, it seems. But where we have the plural, it seems that we have Matthew and Luke and even Mark talking to their congregation, standing up in the pulpit and saying, you. Now I'm talking about all of you here. And we can't do it in English, but we can do it in most other languages, certainly in Greek. Now let's go to Matthew. Buried away in verse 3, notice, but when you, singular, give to charity, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. The but, of course, is there to show you that this sentence is tied into what goes before. So that if you were to have been listening to Jesus give this originally, he would have said, when you give to charity, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Don't forget, these are my translations. I use the word charity where the NRSV will say almsgiving. That's what you read in the King James Version, and the New Revised Standard Version is precisely that. It is a revision of what ultimately goes back to the King James, and the King James itself goes back almost another century to Wycliffe's translation. So we've never, within the authorized translations, we've never really had a breakout translation that deals with the very best knowledge we have in terms of manuscripts or in terms of grammatical knowledge. It has to be done on an individual basis. And then you're running up against tradition. So I warn you from time to time here that what you're looking at is quite different from what you're used to. Charity is what we give to. So that seemed to me to be a contemporary meaning of exactly what Jesus was talking about. Now let's go back up. So do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing is identical to Thomas. So here is our multiple attestation. So we could feel comfortable that this saying goes back to Jesus. It's identical. It does not occur in Luke. Luke just did not have a place where he felt he needed to include it. Mark doesn't have it because Mark doesn't know about it. He does not have Q or in his own congregation. But Matthew precedes this authentic saying by his own preliminary commentary. Beware of practicing your righteousness, and righteousness is another one of those favorite words of Matthew. Before others, I've translated others here where it has man. We have in both Greek and Hebrew 2 words for man. In English, up until the middle of the 20th century, we could use the word man, and by that we meant either a male individual or we meant a human as opposed to animals of some other sort, which was a little bit unfortunate because we in English also have another word, and that's the word human. So human is the word that should be used to cover the totality of, say, the non-bird, non-bestial part of life. And then man could be left merely for the male part, and the woman will then be for the female part of the human. Well, we have it even more clearly expressed in Greek and in Hebrew. And there are many places in the Bible where in King James time and right up until the RSV, the NRSV tried to be inclusive. It wasn't entirely successful, but it tried. But up to the RSV, we weren't really trying. Wherever it said one of these words, we translated man. And that was really unfortunate, because even in the Hebrew Bible, there are all kinds of places. The whole of Genesis 1, for instance, where it talks about man, it doesn't say man, it's the word for human. And in the Greek, in most of these passages, especially where I've translated others or person or someone or anyone, it is the word which in English gives us the word anthropology. The word anthropos in Greek means human. Aner means male. So if we don't have aner, we don't have Jesus being explicitly male, and we don't have that. So all of these passages use the word anthropos. So we are talking about people. Wherever I found it not rendered smoothly by human, I then used person, or in this case, others, in order to be seen by them. For then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. This is all vocabulary that is a part of Matthew's toolkit. Verse 2, whenever you give to charity, do not sound a trumpet before you. Well, that phrase, whenever you give to charity, he's picked that up from verse 3. True, this is his own writing, but what he's inherited is verse 3. He's preceded it with verses 1 and 2. And in 2, he's leading into what he has inherited with the identical phrase. Whenever you give to charity, don't give, because another favorite bugaboo of Matthew's is that the Pharisees. In Jesus' time, the Pharisees weren't a great problem, particularly in the villages of Galilee, but they were a major problem in the post-70 era in the cities, when the temple of in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70, it wiped out the entire sacrificial system. It wiped out the official major practices of Judaism of the day. But for the last almost 200 years, the Pharisees had been trying to work out a system in which the everyday ordinary person could be holy like the priest. So once the need for a priesthood ceased to exist, voila, the Pharisees were in the right place at the right time. So from 70 on, Judaism more and more became a branch of Phariseeism rather than Sadduceeism or Essenism or any of the other kinds of Jewish sects that existed while the temple was in existence. So along with the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people moving out into the sort of non-Jewish world, the Jewish people had been emigrating from the homeland for centuries. I mean, as far back as Babylonian times, you could say as far back as Assyrian times. Jews were moving out as foreign armies came in and took over. The Syrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Macedonians, and now the Romans. So that there were Jewish settlements everywhere in the Roman world and in the Persian world. So that when Jerusalem was destroyed, and particularly the intellectual leaders had to flee because their lives were endangered, there were lots of places they could go. And so they would go to, let's say, Antioch, for instance, where the first major Christian groups were growing up. And the Pharisaic leaders were not too happy with what the Christian leaders were saying about their form of Judaism. The earliest Christians, remember, were Jews. They were going to a synagogue. But they were so insistent that Jesus was the Messiah that the synagogue got sick and tired of putting up with them, and they were beginning to excommunicate them. So that by the year 80, this is now 10 years after, so you've got these exiles going into these non-Jewish cities, forming synagogal groups. But now we've had enough with these heretics. These people claiming that Jesus was the Messiah were understood by the mainstream Judaism of the day to be heretics. And so they were being treated like heretics. So therefore, Matthew writing, and when is he writing? Around 85, just about the time that this was at its height. Every chance he gets against the Pharisees, he does so. And of course, by putting it in the mouth of Jesus, it gives it a degree of authenticity, a degree of authority, not authenticity, a degree of authority that wouldn't be there if the current Christian leaders were merely to say that the Pharisees were hypocrites. I will say something, I might as well say it now since I've already mentioned a hypocrite. The word hypocrite is, of course, a Greek word. And I cannot think of a Greek word, a Hebrew word, and I certainly don't know an Aramaic word that would come across in what hypocrite means. The word hypocrite in Greek means a mask. A hypocrite was an actor, someone who went on stage to play a role. So Tom, who's going to play the role of Zeus, puts a Hippocrates on his face, and this tells the audience that he is Zeus. So the word hypocrite, once it was moved out of the dramatic context, then it came to have the feeling, well, a hypocrite is something other than what it is. So a hypocrite is a mask which hides what's really there and pretends something else. I'm pretending to be Zeus. So when someone in a secular setting is said to be a hypocrite, what he's being told is that he's wearing a mask. If you're being good to someone and we know you well enough to know that's not the real you, that is being a hypocrite. You are wearing a mask. You are pretending to be generous, but we know you to be a miser. And as we'll see eventually in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, where he has this long list of you hypocrites, and he's talking about the Pharisees, just one paragraph after another of these hypocrites. Well, of course, they were not hypocrites. They were devout believers, believing something a little different than what the early Christian communities were believing. I'm going to come back to that at one of the sayings that should show up this evening, if I don't move too slowly. So out of this large saying of Matthew, verses 1 to 4 in chapter 6, all we're going to come out with at the bottom of this box is Jesus saying, now, when you give alms, which I've translated charity, when you give to charity, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. See, this is so contrary to secular society. secular society wants their name published in a book. They want their name on the building that they built. It's the complete opposite. We do the complete opposite to what Jesus expected us to do. Now, if I were a religious leader in a congregation that was comfortably financially well off, how would I deal with this? Well, it seems to me the way to deal with this is to keep reminding the congregation that Jesus was an apocalyptist. We don't have to be judged. First of all, we just were told last week not to be judgmental. So that's situation number one. Don't be judgmental about rich people who want full credit for what they do. But secondly, we have every expectation that life is going to go on and on and on. As bad as things seem to be, 100 years from now, not us, but society, humans, will likely still be here. That is not what Jesus believed. And Jesus' teachings were based on the fact that the world is going to come to, as we know it, is going to come to an end very soon. And what will be taking place afterwards is a world like the one that I'm describing. So if you're going to be able, if you wish to enter the kingdom, this is the kind of behavior you need to practice. So it means if we were to sit down after we finish this study and say, now what can we do with Jesus' ethical teachings? They were presented for one setting, but we are in a different setting. Do we have to take what Jesus said and not at all modify it for the world we're in? I would have liked to have seen the church to do some of these things, and maybe we will in the remainder of the 21st century, when the environment and other things have drawn to our attention that we've not done so well more recently. Anyway, like it or not, this is what Jesus says. We are to give without any idea that anybody knows, even ourselves, what it is we've done. Number 15, on profaning the holy. We read in Matthew, do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearl to the pigs. They will only trample them underfoot. They will turn around and tear you to pieces. Every time I read this, I simply move on to the next verse because I can't make any sense out of it at all. What is this? What context would Jesus ever have found himself in that he would have said this? And it doesn't really make sense anyway, because dogs don't trample. Now pigs do. So some scholars have suggested we have here a kind of chiasm. If I'd had all the time in the world on Sunday, I would have loved to show you some things about Hebrew poetry. One of the beautiful things Hebrew likes to do is what we call a chiasm. So sort of an X shape. They'll say something here and something here. And then the third phrase will not be a parallelist. It will be related to the second one. And then the fourth one is related to the first. So if we take a look at Thomas in this passage, do not give what is holy to dogs, for they might throw them upon the manure pile. Do not throw pearls to pigs, or they might. Now, remember, I told you we do have a few patches in this Coptic manuscript, and this is where we have one, so we don't know what it is they will do. It looks as if Thomas couldn't make any sense out of what he inherited, other than we are not to throw what is clean to that which is unclean. In Judaism, dogs and pigs are a part of uncleanliness. In fact, in the Near East, even now, I lived in an Arab village for 5 summers, and the dogs are not pets. They are garberators. Their job is to go around the village eating what? So if a child is eating a banana, for instance, and throws the peel down, the dog cleans it up. The villages are quite clean, and that's the purpose of the dog. They are nobody's pets. Even the children weren't playing with the dogs. The dogs weren't wild. I mean, they were wild in the sense that they were nobody's pets, but they weren't wild in the sense that they would have bit a child. But the children just didn't play with dogs. It's just not what they do, at least not in the village that I was in. And from what I've read, this is standard throughout the Semitic world. But given what they eat and the manner of living, this would be understood by Jewish ritual laws as quite unclean. So it turned back to Matthew now, do not give what is holy, that is what is clean, to dogs, that is what is unclean. And of course, we all know that Jewish people will not eat pig material. So it is one of the highest levels of uncleanness. Do not throw your pearls to the pigs. They will trample them underfoot. That is to say, the pigs will trample them underfoot. And the next day, will turn around and tear you to pieces. That's what the dogs will do if they're wild. So here's our chiasm. So that's a beautiful poem that we've got in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. But it's hard to believe that that's what Jesus would have said. So I've concluded that what is in common between Matthew and Thomas is what Jesus might have said. Do not, remember, Jesus is a good Jew. So do not give what is clean to what is unclean. And he uses the example of dogs and pigs, what is holy. I'm not quite sure why the pearls, except that later on he is going to use pearl in one of his parables. Now, what could this have meant? It has been suggested by some scholars that what Jesus was suggesting is that there is a limit to your missionary activity. If it is our job, that is to say, Jesus talking to his disciples just before they go out on a mission, for instance. So what you are doing is to announcing the coming of the kingdom. And you are before a group in which there are individuals or a large number of individuals who simply will not accept what you're saying, and you are determined to win them. And so instead of moving on to the next village, to telling them that the kingdom is coming, you stay here and waste your time trying to convince the unconvincible. I do not know whether that's what Jesus meant by this, but that is what some scholars have said, and otherwise I have no idea what he means by this phrase. The golden rule. The golden rule is, as probably most of you know, widespread in many religions, maybe all religions. And so to conclude that it is an authentic saying of Jesus, some scholars would say no. But that's because they've started with the exercise determining what I'm going to accept as authentic from Jesus is what Jesus himself personally coined. But I don't think that's what we want to do here. What we want, what what I want to know is what Jesus said, because that was how he felt about something. It doesn't matter to me whether Jesus inherited it from the Old Testament, whether he inherited from common wisdom sayings, whether he inherited it from his own generation, religious leaders. If he said it in a context that was positive, that's good enough for me. That's all I want to know. I don't need to know, yeah, but who was the first person that came up with that? That might be interesting, but that's not what I'm after when I'm reading the Bible. When I'm reading the Gospels, particularly, as a Protestant, particularly, I want to know what Jesus said. I don't want to know what Matthew thinks Jesus said, when in fact, Jesus didn't mean what Matthew says he means. That's what I want to know. And that's the assumption I've made in starting this. So therefore, it doesn't matter to me that Jesus isn't the one that came up with the golden rule, but he approves the golden rule. In Luke, let's take a look at Luke first. Even as you want others to treat you, treat them likewise. If we take a look at Matthew, in whatever way you would want others to treat you, that's the way you're to treat them. The wording is a little bit different, but the sentiment is the same. It does not occur in Mark, therefore it comes from Q, since the vocabulary is so common between the two of them. And you will notice that we've in fact concluded by using Luke's wording in this case, even as you want others to treat you, treat them the same way. And in many ways, I've tried to translate literally. If I were, well, the translations that I gave you 3 years ago from Mark, 2 years ago from Matthew, and this year, which I would have given you last year for Luke, they're not meant for public worship. It's not meant for right now where we're comparing. It was meant for us when we were studying Mark, Matthew, and Luke. See, this is the situation. When you're translating something, there's always more than one way to translate. You know that by any literature that you are aware of in another language. You can go to the library and you look that book up and you see there are whatever, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen English translations of this same French or German or Japanese or Chinese work. And it isn't a case of one is right and the others are wrong. They all are right, but they are each interpreting. The author might show up and say in individual cases, well, that's not what I meant. But might like something, the very next sentence you might like very much. Goes to another translation, the same part, and have a completely opposite attitude, response to the translation. So when I translate, I'm always translating with my audience in mind, because after all, someone who can read the language doesn't translate for himself. When you translate, you're always translating for someone else. So when I translate, in most cases, I'm translating for you here in Christ First. So what am I doing it for? Am I doing it in a spiritual setting? Am I doing it for an intense study of an individual author? Or in this case, we want to compare one version against another version. So if you were to take these individual verses and take a look at what I gave you last year and the years before, they will differ in little ways, but it doesn't mean that what you're holding as a translation of Mark or Matthew or Luke is wrong. It's not that I've realized I was wrong and I've changed it. It's I've given a word, a Greek word that has got this range of meanings, but the minute I translate, I've cut that down. Now that I want to look at this material for a different reason, I've chosen this word rather than this word to try. So I want to get Luke as close to Mark and Matthew as I can, so that when it's different, you know it's different in the Greek. Interestingly, there are times, and there's one that might show up tonight, it's what I've got ready for tonight, in which it's a subtle difference between Matthew and Luke. But if you put both of each of them, I was thinking in my mind as I was going over this weekend, if I had given an exercise to my class and said, give them the English version of this Greek passage and an English version of this. So in other words, I'll give them one half of the class, I'll give an English translation of Matthew to translate into Hebrew, and an English translation of Luke to translate into Hebrew. Given that the Greek of Matthew and Luke is different, and it's possible to come up with an English translation that is different, but when you put it back into Hebrew, it becomes the same. Both halves of the class, if they got it right, would have handed in the same translation. So this is what we need to do if we want to know what Jesus actually said. He didn't speak Greek. He spoke a Semitic language. He spoke Aramaic, but I'm increasingly thinking he did a lot of his thinking in Hebrew. He did a lot of thinking in Hebrew. That's not quite right. He probably couldn't think in Hebrew, but it was those Hebrew phrases that were running in his head. He knew his Bible well, and the Hebrew Bible is a big Bible. And so he had all kinds of phrases running in his head, which was in Hebrew, even though he was thinking and speaking in Aramaic. So I think it's legitimate for us to do this exercise. Okay, let's take the break now, and we'll come back at 8 minutes after 8 and move on to number 17. 17, Matthew, do not judge that you not be judged. The way he's written it up as a purpose clause, the reason you don't judge is so that you won't be judged. Whereas in Luke, do not judge and you will not be judged. So here we have a result clause. Basically the same, but almost as if Matthew's suggesting that, well, I'd like to judge, but the reason I'm not going to is I don't want to be judged. Whereas Luke is suggesting you don't judge, and if you don't judge, you won't be judged. Almost as if that it is a kind of reward. He doesn't spell it out that way. So how would Jesus have given this? Well, this is the beauty of the Semitic language. In a Semitic language, you wouldn't make a distinction between the two types of clauses. You could, but you don't have to. You just put the two clauses side by side and then link them with a syllable that doesn't mean anything. And you've got the two together. And it's up to the reader, the interpreter, how he wants to put them together. And what we've got here is Matthew going one direction and Luke going another. It will be interesting to know how Q wrote it up. The Q scholars have suggested that it's likely Matthew. Do not judge that you be not judged. For as you judge, you will be judged. So that would be the reason for not judging. I have a feeling that Jesus would have meant, you don't judge because in the kingdom, we don't. In Luke, we have the second phrase, do not condemn and you will not be condemned. This is just parallelism. But it is parallelism that Q scholars have suggested is not in his source. And similarly, Matthew has a secondary remark, for in passing judgment, by that judgment, you will be judged. They both have a feeling that they need the parallelism, and you understand what that word is now after Sunday's sermon, that this is the way Hebrew poetry works. You say something and then you say it again with completely different words. And it gives you the meaning with a double whammy. In Paul's writings in the letter to the Romans, the church in Rome, both at the beginning and the end of his letter, you have no excuse wherever you are when you sit in judgment, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. It almost looks as if he's aware of Luke, who has used both the word judge and the word condemn. But of course, Luke is writing something like 25 years after Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. And in the 14th chapter of the Romans, similar thought, let us no longer pass judgment on one another. Instead, resolve never to put an impediment or hindrance in the way of another. So in other words, not only do you not judge, you make sure that you aren't the cause of somebody being put in a situation that you would judge negatively. The conclusion I've given as do not judge that you not be judged, for as you judge, you will be judged. And this is another case where I'm less certain than I once was, but you'll notice it's the third degree of authenticity. And in other words, Jesus was opposed to the activity of judging. One does not judge others, but I think that's as far as Jesus went. He didn't give a reason. This is just the way we do things in the kingdom. So if I were to do this again, I would drop the second. For as you judge, you will be judged. It's probably true, but not at the forefront of what Jesus wanted to get across. Notice the references, the chapters. What we've been looking at so far has been within Matthew chapters 5 to 7 and within Luke chapter 6, verses 20 to 49. This is within the sermons. So this is behavior of an extremely high standard. This is the highest as a collection of material. So on forgiving, in Mark, we have the saying, whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven also may forgive you your transgressions. You see, this is, although this comes from Mark, it is going to be, I've placed it here, not because of where it is in Mark, but because of where it is in Matthew. It falls within the Sermon on the Mount, and it is closely related to the theme of judging. That is, you don't judge anyone. On the contrary, you do just the opposite. You forgive. Matthew says, if you forgive others their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your transgressions. Verse 15 is just verse 14 put negatively. And to that extent, it is unlikely to have come from Jesus. Jesus would have put it positively and would not need to spell out the negative equivalent. Jesus tended not to be negative. In Luke, we have completely different wording, and scholars have concluded that Luke, other than the general idea, has borrowed nothing from Mark. He even has a different word than forgive. He doesn't use the same word that Mark and Matthew use. He says, well, I've translated it pardon, because I wanted to get away from a different word from Mark and Matthew, because it's a different word in Greek. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and gifts will be given to you. This seems very strange to me. And as we're going to see in number 19, verse 38 of Luke is followed up by an even stranger saying, in which Luke is trying to suggest that the Christian way of life is really the smart way to go. Because if you forgive, you'll be forgiven. If you pardon, you'll be pardoned. If you don't judge, you won't be judged. And if you give, you will be given magnanimously, as we'll see in the next saying. All we've got to go on is the simple word that Mark uses, forgive. As a side note here, Mark says, whenever you stand praying, notice the proper form to be in when you pray. We in the United Church tend to sit on our butts when we pray. Other traditions at least kneel. I believe the Church of Scotland, I don't know whether it still does, stands to pray. Almost any picture that you see from the ancient world, certainly from Egypt, of praying, it's always with the hands raised, with the palms open, facing the statue of the God that you're praying to. The idea being that when you pray, you demonstrate your innocence. My hands are clean. There's no blood on them, and I carry no weapon. What I am saying, whether I am praising the deity or whether I am making a request, it is with sincerity and honesty. So that praying in the ancient world was done standing, and usually with the hands raised, palms wide open, facing forward. So that saying is fairly straightforward, and we conclude by simply saying, Jesus said, forgive. As a corollary, you will be forgiven as well. I would say, based on a finished study of all of the sayings and activities of Jesus, that Jesus, he didn't begin his ministry this way. In my reconstruction, Jesus was heavily influenced by John the Baptist. But when he went out on his own and began to preach what he had learned from John, it didn't take very long for him to back off a little bit from what John had said. So that Jesus came to, if I'm understanding him correctly, and that's questionable, or at least it's not universally accepted by scholars. But as I read him, he came to realize that the God whose kingdom he was talking about was a God who offered forgiveness without any conditions. If there was a condition, the condition was, it's of no use to you if you don't accept it. In that sense, Martin Luther was right. The forgiveness, the redemption, if you will, that Jesus was proclaiming, I'm not even sure he was offering it. He was proclaiming it. It's there. All we have to do is accept it. Now, in accepting it, there's a kind of understanding that you will want to please the God that has granted you this forgiveness. And I can tell you how you can do that. What God would like is, and then we move into all of these, what we think of as ethical stipulations. They really aren't ethical stipulations. It's a simple case of, I'm here to tell you that God has granted you everything that you've been searching for. And now that you're free of that burden, would you help me present that to everybody else? And you do that by this kind of behavior, the behavior of the kingdom, where you don't judge, you forgive, you give whatever someone else needs without any expectation of either reward or praise or return. That's what the kingdom is like. The difference between what Jesus is claiming and how we will receive it is we are living 2,000 years later, when Jesus said there would be no 2,000 years later. So how do we take these high standards, these very high standards, and make them work in a world that is going to go on and on and on? That's much harder for us to do. But I think the first half is something that we really need to hear more of. And that is, forgiveness is there. And that's why we don't have to judge. God doesn't judge. So why should we? $19, says measure for measure. This is all tied in with these sermons. We have something very interesting here in 19. It puzzles me a bit. You'll see that Mark says, the measure you give will be the measure you get. We take a look at Matthew and we say, the measure you give will be the measure you get. We take a look at Luke. Luke has got something else. I warned you that this was coming. But on that third line, he too concludes with exactly the same words. In Greek, all three of them say the same thing. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. And yet you will see that on the title line, 19, measure for measure, I say that the source is Mark and Q. Now, how do we know it's from Mark? Well, we know it's from Mark because we can see it in Mark. Well, how do we know it's in Q? Well, we know it's in Q if the identical wording is in Luke and Matthew, which it is, but that is only true if it's not in Mark, because if it's in Mark and Matthew and Luke are using Mark, why would you conclude it comes from Q? Well, in this case, you need to go back to that section. I think it's pages 10, probably pages 10 to 17, where I gave you a list of all the topic headings. There you would notice that within the two sermons, both the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, practically all of the sayings come from Q. They don't come from Mark. There are two that come from Mark, but scholars have concluded, and here I defer to New Testament scholars. I don't know what arguments they use, and so I can't present to you why they are so confident that this is also in Q. I can make a guess, and that is that since all other sayings within the sermons are from Q, this one probably also is. Secondly, if you take the context in which we find them in Q, it fits beautifully. Whereas if you take it out, there is a perceived gap. And a third argument might be that doesn't it make perfectly good sense that there are going to be some of the most certain sayings of Jesus that are so universally widespread that both Mark and Q will have them. We will see several instances of a saying in Mark and in Q, but in those cases, we will discover it because we will have the same saying in Matthew and or Luke twice, in which the theme is the same, but the words are a little bit different. And it's relatively easy to pull them apart. So that one of the sayings in Matthew and another one in Luke looks very much like what we find in Mark. And the second one is similar within Mark and Luke, within Matthew and Luke. In other words, Matthew and Luke's second record of this saying is much like each other. And that's the signal that it comes from Q. You still have the possibility, of course, that they could have a similar saying worded so differently from anywhere else that it comes from M or L, the material that is exclusive to Matthew and to Luke, but not necessarily editorial. So I offer this to you from the New Testament Q scholars, that the The measure for measure saying of Jesus is from both Q and Mark. But notice that it is only the third level of authenticity. To put this in its simplest form, the Greek word for measure is, when you try to go back into Hebrew, seems more complicated than necessary. And so this is not my wording, but I've accepted this wording. What you give will be what you get. That sounds more like Jesus. Then the measure by which you measure will be the measurement that will be handed out to you. That doesn't sound like Jesus. But what you give will be what you get. That's the way Jesus spoke. And don't forget that what we've got was circulated orally for a minimum of 20 years and possibly 30 before they were written down. And that means the shorter and the more easily it rolled off the tongue is what's more likely to be remembered and remembered accurately. There'll be lots of things that were remembered but weren't remembered accurately, or things that were remembered and in one community came out this way, in another community that were separated from each other for a decade or more came out differently, and then is inherited by our evangelists in the later half of the first century slightly differently. Then with their editorial interests, they made a few more adjustments. This Bible study, I need to warn you, is more personal than what you would ordinarily get. Ordinarily, a Bible teacher would tell you what he or she had read out of a book. What I'm sharing with you is something that I've been studying for 75 years in the Hebrew and Greek, can you believe it, for 65 years. So I cannot vouch for the accuracy of some of what I'm telling you. Much of it is a gut thing. I've walked with Jesus for decades. And I have a feeling that I might not be able to convince someone with different views. I did warn you at the beginning of this study that I'm taking an historian's approach. As a believer, there's much more that I wouldn't question. As an historian, there are some things I question, and I find, as a believer, I find it more comfortable to try to put my beliefs, what I believe, into an historical context. It makes sense. And believe it or not, holding that the human being Jesus was human does not have to destroy any belief in the divinity of the post-resurrection period. We're talking two different things here. We are studying about what Jesus did when Jesus was a human being. Why did he say what he said? What did he say? And what is the background for these things he said? What the church came to believe after the resurrection was very different from what was circulating in the lifetime of Jesus himself. We know that today in a way that we did not know it 70 years ago. When I look back on my theological training, I realize my teachers did not know We didn't have the tools 70 years ago that we've got today. We didn't have the material that we've got today. We didn't have the attitude 70 years ago that we have today. You know that for the last half dozen years, I've been sitting at the back of the church. I need to get out quickly to go feed Mary. And what do I see Sunday after Sunday? Generally speaking, white heads. If we want to attract our grandchildren, we've got to relate our post-resurrection theology with the historical information that they are more in tune with. Not that they understand the history, they've been turned off. But if we could teach Jesus as we teach Julius Caesar, I think with proper theologically trained teachers, it would be easier, more successful at getting them to see the truth in the Christian religion, rather than taking a look at the terrible things that the church has done. Sorry about that. That's not what I intended to say. So this brings us to 20 blind guides, teaching blind guys. So am I blind? You'll notice that this saying in Luke comes from his Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, but Matthew comes from chapter 15. When Luke says, can one blind person, I've said one here in contrast to Matthew, who in the phrase, I haven't quoted it here, but in the phrase immediately before 14b, so in Matthew 15 verse 14a, he actually spells out that the Pharisees are blind guides. He's very specific. The Pharisees are blind guides. Then he quotes Jesus. And so he moves to the singular, which is out of context from what he was saying. So to be explicit as to what is there in the Greek, I've added the numeral here, 1. If a blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit, Matthew says. Whereas Luke says, can a blind person guide another? Wouldn't they both fall into a pit? That sounds more like Jesus. Jesus tended to ask questions. He leaves it for you to decide whether this is right or wrong or good or useful. And Q scholars have thus concluded that the wording in Luke is more likely to be closer to what Jesus said. Can a blind, I don't mean to stress the numeral 1 here. I just want to get away from the plural because I want you to realize Jesus was not talking about the Pharisees, even though that is what it looks like in Matthew's context. Can a blind person guide another blind person? Now, the next saying, which is not numbered, is because scholars have concluded it's not genuine. In Luke, let's take a look at Luke first. A disciple is not above the teacher. Right off the bat, that does not sound like Jesus. It sounds logical. It sounds normal. It sounds like something we would all agree with. But Jesus did not believe in hierarchies. In the kingdom, everyone is equal. Everyone is equal. Why would Jesus be talking about his, presumably he'd be talking about his disciples, because what other disciples would there would be? But this appears to be a generalization. In fact, we have Matthew saying, a disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. There's always a problem here with that translation of the word slave. The word in Greek means slave, but in many of our English translations, we translate it servant, because the American system of slavery has muddied the situation for us. In the ancient world, this term covered those people who were the property of an owner. And these people were not treated like black slaves in the southern United States. There were other countries as well, but we're so familiar with the American situation. But that's not the kind of slavery in the ancient world. A person became a slave simply because, well, for a number of reasons, but two cities going to war with one another, the losers ended up being the slaves to the winners. And they understood that. That was the result of having lost. But there was mutual respect. The slave was owned, but the slave was making some kind of wage and could, over a number of years, save enough money to actually buy his own freedom. And depending on the ability of the slave might, well, there were cases where the slave rose to be prime minister of the country, but still remained slave because he hadn't purchased his freedom. In that case, probably because he didn't want to buy his freedom. He was quite content being the prime minister of the country. Or other cases, as we'll see in some of Jesus' parables, they rise to be the chief steward of wealthy individuals. So do I translate this as slave or as servant? Because it's not really servant either. These were not servants. These, in some cases, were high officials. Slave here means owned by someone else. They are not free to do exactly what they want. There may be some freedoms that were granted to them by their master, but that's because it was granted to them by their master. So here's another situation where translating is a problem. Neither slave nor servant works very well. So the best we can do is to explain what we mean by this term. And that you will notice towards the bottom of this box, we've got two quotations from the Gospel of John, in which he doesn't even talk about the disciples. He just talks about the slave. The slave is not greater than the master in chapter 13. And in 15, servants are not greater than their master. The reason I turned to servants here is because the word in the Greek is different than the word in chapter 13. This is someone who works for someone else, but it's not quite an employee. Now, Matthew goes on to talk about it is not enough for the disciple to be like the teacher or the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? Well, what is he talking about here? Scholars have generally concluded that he's talking about his contemporaries. I've already explained to you that the Pharisees are the great bugaboo of the Christian communities in the 8th decade of the first century. And the leaders of the synagogues are dealing out a great deal of grief to the specifically Christian leaders. So Matthew is saying at this point, well, you know what they did to Jesus. Why do you expect to be treated any better? We should have realized that the synagogue leaders would do this to us, given what they did to Jesus. And he uses the phrase Beelzebul, which we're going to see later in connection with Jesus. He is his ability to perform great feats of power are attributed to the forces of what is the opposite to good, since I refuse to use the word evil. And so he's said to be a follower, a disciple of Beelzebul. This term Beelzebul is a Canaanite word originally. The word Baal, B-E-E-L, means Lord. And Zebul is actually a word which means prince. And it goes back to the chief god of the Canaanites, who later on became the Phoenicians. This was the god Hadad. Within the biblical, let us say the Old Testament, we have this god referred to in only one chapter, about 4 times in 2 Kings chapter 1, as the local god of Ekron. However, in Kings, he's not said to be Baal-zebul, but Baal-zebub. This is a derogatory remark in which the word Zebul means prince, but the word Zebub means flies. So the Hebrew speakers in the area next to the city of Ekron kept talking about their god as Baal-zebub, so much that whenever they even officially wanted to refer to the god of Ekron, they sort of forgot what the real name was, and they called him Baal-zebub. And that's what gets into the Bible. And I think we use that. There's the Lord of the Flies. Oh, the Lord, there was a book back in the 50s or 60s, the Lord of the Flies. Well, it's this god of Ekron. Later on, Beelzebul, and when I say later on, I mean later Christian medieval history, becomes one of the alternate names for Satan. Satan has a collection of names, and this is another one of them. So scholars have concluded that this saying arose within the early Christian church, trying to put students in their place. It is not something Jesus would have said. 21, the splinter and log. This is a longer passage, and if you'll see at the bottom, the Q, the strategy that I've used is that I will give the print showing the degree of authenticity with only one speaker. If there is great variety, I will give a separate paragraph for Jesus. But where Mark and with Matthew and Luke are so close together that we can easily get back to Q, have no further information to get beyond Q, I have left Q as the reconstruction for Jesus. So the fact that you see that in bold print shows you that I have decided that that's as far back as we can get, but even so, it's with a high degree of authenticity. So rather than go through what Matthew and Luke say, because they are very much alike, the differences, the minor differences between Luke and Matthew boils down to Matthew with his more elegant Greek. That's really all we've got. We've got them looking at the same text, but Luke knows he can write it up a little bit more, more polished way. And so he's done so. So let's us go straight to Q. Why do you look at the Splinter? And this is my translation, because what I wanted to get across here is Jesus' way of, this is not a parable yet, but this, he uses parables and he exaggerates. It's one of his characteristics, great exaggerate, I mean, enormous. The classic example is the camel going through the eye of a needle. And scholars over the centuries have spilled all kinds of ink trying to figure out what Jesus meant. Well, all he meant was, it's impossible. A rich person, in the context in which Jesus was giving it, a rich person can't get into heaven. It's that simple. Now, you can take the other sayings of Jesus and we can modify what he meant by rich person. But in this setting, he was saying there is no way a person whose heart is set on the accumulation of wealth is ever going to make it into the kingdom. A camel would have an easier time going through the eye of a needle. Now, is that ridiculous or isn't it? Of course it's ridiculous. Just like a person whose goal in life is to achieve great wealth is also not one who's going to make it or even want to make it into the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus was trying to say. So here he talks about two objects. It's normally translated speck, I think, a piece of dust. I've forgotten what the other one was. But what Jesus, I can take the Greek and I can move it into the Hebrew. And what I see Jesus saying is a little object and a big object, but they're identical. And that's why I've used Splinter, because what Jesus is talking about is this little object that is so small, you don't even realize it's in your eye. But you look at this other fellow and no, I've got that backward, haven't I? He's got the log in his eye. It's just a bigger version of what he clearly sees in the other guy's eye, totally oblivious to his own shortcomings. This saying in its present form is longer than we normally see with Jesus, but when we come to the parables, you can see that if it was a narrative or something that was easily remembered, then it is possible that longer sayings of Jesus were remembered. So here, why do you look at the splinter in your neighbor's eye, but the log in your own eye you do not notice? Now that's an impossibility as we read it. With a log in your eye, first of all, which you couldn't get there, but if it was there, you wouldn't see anything. But Jesus wants to take two items and exaggerate them. How can you say to your neighbor, that may take the splinter out of your eye? This is, of course, a metaphor for being critical. The whole idea is that we each have faults. I, who have this major fault, want to draw to your attention this minor fault that you've got. And Jesus said, this is not the kind of behavior that is acceptable in the kingdom, that will even take place in the kingdom. And therefore, on the part of those who are like this, entry into the kingdom is an impossibility. Second from the last line, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take out the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. This saying is given a high degree of authenticity. I have two caveats. One is the word hypocrite. Jesus would not, well, first of all, he would not have used the word hypocrite because he didn't speak Greek. But I don't know of an Aramaic or a Hebrew word that's a hypocrite. But knowing that Jesus was steeped in the Old Testament, I suspect what Jesus did say was, you fool. We see that again and again in the book of Proverbs. And likely, if Jesus did say something like this, and most scholars are agreed that he did, he probably said, you're foolish, you're a fool. The second difficulty I have with this is, then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. If that can be interpreted as a positive thing, such as I wish to help you, and when in my unblemished condition, I can point out how you could straighten your life out. That's a possibility, but as a judgment, of course, it would not be what Jesus would say. But I'm not in a position to gainsay what New Testament scholars have concluded. So I offer that to you as a high degree of authenticity. But someday, if we find some more manuscripts buried away somewhere, we may find that, in fact, it's that last sentence, it needs to be changed. Now, I wonder, in 5 minutes, can we do? The next one seems very long. I mean, is very long, but it's because, yeah, it's complex. It's too complex. All right. No one said we had to go full 2 hours. Any questions? Let us pray. Our Father, as Jesus taught us to call you, let your rule hold sway over us. Let it happen sooner rather than later. Let it be among us rather than without us. Let it increase rather than decrease. Make us respond to the call to fellowship with you and to service with those who journey in the faith, and never let us forget that you walk with us. In Jesus' name we pray. That's it.
But somewhere I heard also that people pray like this to receive the grace of God. I don't know. Have you ever heard of this? That we should open up your hands like this?
For a prayer of petition, that makes sense. Confession of sin, it needs to be this. Thanksgiving, I would almost also think would be this way, but you're right. If you're actually I believe the basic meaning of the word prayer is request. That if I'm not an anthropologist, but if we could go back to our first evidence of people praying, it likely was more for requests than for praise. Praise in human experience is likely secondary. In a sophisticated, complex society like ours, we realize for politeness sake, we start with thanks. And then, oh, by the way, I've got this problem. Yeah,